This is Cast of Wonders, the young adult fiction podcast featuring stories of the fantastic. Welcome! You're listening to Little Wonders, our collection episodes featuring flash fiction and poetry centered around a theme. And since it's almost Halloween, that means it's time for scary stories. Our first story is Come With Me by Beth Hull. Beth Hull lives in my old hometown, Northern California, with her artist/scientist husband, their 2 children, and a cat who thinks she's a dog. Beth writes young adult novels and the occasional short story. To learn more about her work, and the things that annoy her, windy days and ticking clocks, and scare her, black widow spiders lurking in the mailbox, you can visit her website, bethhull.com. or find her on Twitter at @TBethHull. Come With Me is narrated for you by podcasting's dark overlord, Alistair Stewart. Alistair is the host of Pseudopod, the weekly horror fiction podcast by escape artists. He also co-hosts Escape Pod, their weekly science fiction show. He blogs about lots of things for lots of people, including himself, at alistairstewart.com. You can listen to him talk about cooking things, reading things, watching things, or training in things like martial arts and baking on Twitter at Alistair Stewart. As always, we'll have links to these and all the other websites we mention in our show notes. Ready for some stories? Good, because frightening things come in small packages.
Come With Me by Beth Hull. Everything about her suggested impermanence. Maybe that's why we were drawn there. It wasn't just the ethereal blonde waves of her hair or the goth pale skin of her slender hands. It was her total, absolute ease at being the new student in our tightly knit little prep school. She drifted, you see. Drifted into junior homeroom on a lotus-scented breeze. And every guy, every single one, sucked in a breath. And the girls, well, we don't know what the girls were doing, because we could only see her. Come with me, she said, singling each of us out. For a day, for an hour, for a week, we were her best friends, her lovers, her confidants, but none of us knew anything about her. Not where she was from, not the school she went to before ours, not even her name. Call me Beatrice, she said. I'm Circe, she said. Morgane, Hermione, Rebecca, Medea, Anne. She was all. She was none. And because of the impermanence, we felt safe. We could get involved. We thought we knew her type. Military brat, probably accustomed to moving, making new friends, and then saying goodbye. She'd be the perfect girlfriend. Come with me, she said to us, and we went. She threw parties in a grand house just outside of town, and you see, September is still warm in California, so we swam in the pool, and we sipped beer and wine and champagne in the spa, played football and watched independent foreign films in the basement theatre until our brains were so addled we couldn't remember which one our mother tongue was. We just knew we loved her, and when she said, "Come with me," we followed. On a clear day in October, I walked with the girl across the quad at school, her slender fingers cold and tightly wrapped around mine. She said, "Come with me." Where are we going? I couldn't believe the question had never occurred to me before. Maybe the sun was different that day and broke the spell. I don't know. I do know a pimple was coming to a white head just below her right nostril, and it was the very first imperfection I'd noticed. She smiled. Savanois. Where's that? Someplace in France? I could buy a plane ticket. I'd go, no question. One pimple was just that. It was just one pimple. See, I thought it was a trip for the 2 of us. So I set aside a portion of my trust fund allowance, and then I learned she'd invited everyone. She'd invited the entire junior class. "Come with me," she said, and we skipped school for a 7 noir planning party. It was too cold to swim. Some people swam. I sat in a chair next to the pool, a bottle of beer in my hand, but I did not feel like drinking. I'd noticed another flaw in this temporary, impermanent girl, a small T-shaped scar just below her ear. It was nothing worse than Owen's forehead scar from field hockey or Madeline's mismatched eyes, but why had I never noticed it before? On her. On someone I studied so intently. I began to notice more. Not only on her person, like the mole on her upper arm or the bright lines of veins on her shins. No, I saw the rusted outdoor chairs. I saw the cracked tiles edging the pool. I saw the dead leaves on the surface of the water that my friends paddled and splashed through as if they didn't see them. And I noticed her. Beatrice, Circe, Morgane, Hermione, Rebecca, Medea, Anne, walking up to each of my friends and placing something small and black in their drinks. My friends peered into the bottom of their cups in wonderment, but with a light touch, with a smile, she distracted them before moving on. And then Owen stopped swimming and began to sink. "Owen!" I tore off my shoes and jumped in the water, struggling to find him among the swirling leaf sludge at the bottom of the pool. I brought him up, shaking water and decayed leaves from my face. I paddled to the shallow end and turned him around, and his eyes were cloudy. Open, they dully reflected a flock of black birds flying overhead. I did something I'd only seen in the movies. I checked his neck for a pulse. There was nothing. Other people sank into the pool around me, collapsed on their chairs, fell to the concrete steps. "Stop drinking!" I yelled to the small group nearest me. "She put something in the drinks!" "Why would she do that?" They laughed and drank and fell. The girl watched from my lounge chair. "What did you do to them?" "We're going to 7 Noir," she said. "Come with me." "No." She took a sip of my beer, then held it up in a salute. "I'll see you in 7 Noir." The bottle fell to the concrete and shattered. She kept her smile even after her eyes clouded over.
When most people think of young adult fiction, they think of fantasy with a heavy sprinkling of science fiction. Horror doesn't seem to be a popular genre, and I can understand why. Thinking about younger people in frightening or dangerous situations isn't very comforting. When you think of Harry Potter, you probably think of the fun times Harry, Ron, and Hermione had, and you glaze over the very real danger they were in. But growing up can be scary, with or without the presence of the supernatural. And unlike a book, you can't put your life down and come back to it later. Learning how to deal with an ugly reality is an important skill. Which brings us to our second story this week, Piper by Ian Rose. Ian is a web developer and former field biologist living in Portland, Oregon. He loves oceans and mountains and rain, and is very pleased to have found a place that offers him all of these, though he does have to visit his native East Coast every year to fill up on bagels, pizza, and other bread products that Oregon just can't seem to get quite right. His blog is ianwrites.com, and his Twitter account is @IanRoseWrites. He also has a story about to be published by New Myths. Your narrator is our very own Barry J. Northern. Barry is a game developer based in Bournemouth, England, making freemium games for clients such as Lego and the BBC. His latest game is breaking all the records on iOS, not surprising with a title like Lego Star Wars Yoda Chronicles. It's for younger kids, but if you fancy blasting alien brains, check out Lego Hero Factory Brain Attack from Asmoo.com. All this gain developing has meant Barry hasn't been as active in the podcasting and fiction worlds as he used to be, but he still works behind the scenes with us here at Cast of Wonders. He also guest narrates on occasion at the Drabblecast and Starship Sofa.
Piper by Ian Rose. He came one day down the northern road, his skin paler than the local men, and his eyes a lighter blue than we had ever seen before. There was a scar above his left eye, and he carried no bag on his shoulder, nothing but his pipes and a flask on his hip. The king had sent word of his people's need far and wide, sparing a few of his dwindling horsemen to carry the plea. Word had reached the piper, who had dealt with this problem before, and so in time the piper came. When he blew on his pipes, we followed him without thought or question. My father went first, then my brother, then, one by one, the rest. They crept at first, then walked, then ran after him, wanting or needing to stay in earshot of the song. I followed the crowd more than the noise itself, my hearing having never quite fully recovered from a bite in the head from the miller's cat a few months back. I huddled into a hidden spot that barely fit me, pressed between the reeds. My muscles twitched, my mind and instinct arguing about whether to help or to hide. Chances are that I could not have helped anyway, and I've never been particularly brave, so I hid and I watched. They all went into the dark brown water, and for a moment it looked as if they would simply swim across. My father had taught me young to avoid the creek at all costs, but in their frenzy their feet could have carried them to the other side. It wasn't the safety of the bank, though, that called them. It was the piper, standing in the centre of the creek, and they huddled around him as they fought to keep their ears more than their mouths above water. When the last of the swimming had stopped, and he waded past them and out of the river, I alone followed him back down the wooded path to town. I was careful to stay hidden and always ready to run, but he barely ever looked back. I wanted to study his face, hoping to detect a sign of regret or maybe just relief. Relief would have been enough, a sort of acceptance of a hard but necessary thing done. When he did turn, and I caught a look at his face, he looked pleased. But it was not the kind of pleasure that a man feels on his way home from a job well done. I've seen that contented look in the miller and the cobbler that lived in our house back in town. This was different, more smug and more scary than that. He was thrilled with himself. The face that he made as he cantered back to town, I'd seen that before too, in the soldiers returning from war. A few of them came back so different from the way they had left, with something new and cruel in them. They had tasted blood again and again. They had come in time to expect it, and at some terrible further point to hunger for more. I followed him until the palace hedge and watched him march to the gate, the townspeople in a tight cone behind him. I chose not to blame them for their perverse excitement, because I had seen what they had all been through. The sheer scale of death that had fallen on our town over the last year was staggering, and their faces were marked with it. To have so many of them die in such a short time, when they were accustomed to living so long, it had to be jarring. The miller and the cobbler had lived with us for generations. My grandfather's father had known them, and I got the sense that they were not even children then. They somehow knew that we were involved, even if they didn't understand how. They could not have known that the fleas that often woke us at night with their itchy little bites carried the disease that was killing them all so quickly. They didn't see the fleas. They only saw us, and where they saw us there was death, and that was proof enough. The piper passed through the main gate and into the palace, his eyes bright and proud. But to hear the townspeople tell it later, the king must have been even prouder and more sure of himself, because when the piper asked for his payment, the king laughed and refused. "We are in your debt," he proclaimed, "but what you ask is too much, a fortune for the task of removing a pest." He offered to pay a small part of the original price. Still, the king said, a handsome reward for a bit of fluting. He hadn't seen what I had, hadn't noticed the shine in the piper's eyes. He couldn't have seen it, or he never would have tried to bargain.
Ian told us that his inspiration for Piper was that in all of the fables and fairy tales he read as a child, the Pied Piper was the only one that really scared him. Not only the power that the Piper had over both rats and the children, but the willingness to use it he found terrifying. The Piper was sort of an avatar for all the threats and dangers in the world that Ian didn't understand at the time, but still knew to be afraid of. And speaking of things you should be afraid of, how about cowled figures rowing tiny boats on dark rivers late at night? For our final scary short, we bring you The Boatman by J.A. Ironside. Jules Ann Ironside started writing as a child. She grew up in Dorset in a house full of books, fed on a diet of myths, legends, and spooky tales. She particularly likes to take well-known myths and turn them on their heads. Jules is a keen martial artist, having taught karate for 15 years. In her free time, she likes to read and add to her collection of dead or little-used languages. She has had several other short stories published in the anthologies Reading is Magic and Stories for Homes, both available from Amazon. Her next published story will appear in the anthology A Chimerical World, Unseelie. You can follow her on Twitter at j_Ann Ironside. And to complete our trio of narrators, The Boatman is read for you by the very talented Ian Stewart. Ian is a writer and performer living and working in York. In the past, he's worked for BBC Local Radio in Manchester and the Isle of Man, where he taught English. As well as providing voice tracks for hotels, businesses, and even foreign language courses, he's a tourist guide for the Ghost Trail of York. I've been on his tour, and you don't want to miss it. And Ian has been a resident voice artist for Pseudopod for many years now. You can read more about his poetry and his dog, Digby, on his blog, The Top Banana, or follow him on Twitter at YorkWriter99.
The Boatman by J.A. Ironside. Soon he would have to row back to the castle. It rose on the opposite bank, a stark black silhouette against the Titian sky. Even from his perch in the stern of his boat he could hear the ravens across the river prophesying death in their harsh voices, although most people would not have understood them. The river that bobbed and swelled under his barge felt alien to him. He supposed the Thames was all right, in its way, but it wasn't his river. He didn't know every eddy and shallow of its teasing tides. The Thames was younger, sleepier, less alive. It dreamed, and sometimes he watched those dreams. It flowed through the city and captured reflections. Here a scrap of blue velvet, a rich young nobleman with a half-dressed woman in the wrong part of town. Here a skinny child, head to toe in thick mud, ancient eyes in a young face. And here a young woman, cloaked and muffled against recognition, a brief flash of a pearl-encrusted slipper. Time to ready the barge. He pulled his hood closer to hide his death's head grin. Even the dead had never reacted well to it, so he supposed that it probably would disturb the living even more. Screaming and swooning seemed excessive in the boatman's opinion, though. At least this work exchange programme would be over soon. The truth was, when the little scroll of parchment had been delivered to him, he hadn't read the details very thoroughly. It had seemed the opportunity he was waiting for, a change of scenery. He'd had no idea he would end up halfway round the world, and 1,500 years into the future to boot. Well, he couldn't argue that the scenery wasn't an improvement. But the rest of the assignment was just downright bewildering. If he'd had flesh on his cheekbones, he would still be blushing with mortification at the memory of leaving several nobles and a bishop waiting on the tower side of the river, despite repeated summons. When he'd finally realised he was supposed to ferry his passengers both ways on this river and collected them, the bishop had refused to pay him. The cloaked woman had reached the barge. He held out a wrapped and gloved hand to help her aboard, braced for her to notice the lack of flesh on his finger bones. She said nothing. Her scarred bodyguard climbed aboard. Not the usual man, the boatman noted. The barge moved smoothly onto the river. Halfway across, the guard stabbed a long knife through the boatman's back. Without waiting to check on the boatman, he turned on the woman, brandishing a second knife. Her face was pale, her lips compressed. The boatman was fascinated. He'd never seen a murder committed, only ferried its victims across the river. The guard's knife grated against his fleshless ribs. He pulled it out. It clattered to the bottom of the boat. Distracted by the noise, the false guard spun, almost losing his footing, which meant the boatman's pole caught him full in the face, smashing his skull. Grinning a genuine death's head grin for once, the boatman hit the guard again, knocking him into the cold waters. "My thanks, sir." The woman was a little breathless but composed. "Ask for any reasonable reward, and it shall be yours." She pushed back her hood to reveal red hair dressed with pearls. "No reward necessary, my lady." She peered forward into the depths of his hood. He braced himself for a scream, but she merely sat back, a considering look on her clever features. "May I have the name of he to whom I am so indebted?" It was not a request. "Karen, my lady." "Elizabeth," she replied, gazing over the water after her would-be assassin. There was not a ripple to show his passing. All rivers dream, and remember in dreaming that they are echoes of the great river between life and death, the Styx. The Thames bore the guardsman's corpse downstream for the mudlarks to find and exclaim over. The boatman smiled again.
That's our stories for this episode. What are you doing for Halloween this year? I was going to World Fantasy Con in Brighton, but then my school schedule changed. Oh well, maybe next time. I guess I'll be staying home and handing out treats instead. Are you enjoying Phoenix watching? The story is really starting to take off. So if you haven't started, now would be a great time to immerse yourself in the world of Felix, RG, and all the other campers at Camp Myth as they work to earn their merit badges this summer. Finally, this Little Wonders, we want to tell you about a new YA audio story you won't want to miss.
Deep in space, in the bowels of the wheel, they run. Meet Mara, crud rat, born to slavery, trained to run, to jump, to clean the great machines that drive the world. And when puberty strikes, expelled, exiled, set adrift to starve and die. From the mind of Gail Carriger, the author of Soulless and the Finishing School series, comes the story of one girl without a home, and one monster chained and ransomed, and their relentless struggle to win their freedom. For the first time anywhere, Gail Carriger's Crud Rat. A full cast production directed by J. Daniel Sawyer, the 4-time Parsec-nominated producer of Down from 10 and The Antithesis Progression, with original music by award-nominated composer Danny Shade. Gail Carriger's Crud Rat. Kickstarting October 1st. Get details at www.crudrat.com.
If you have something to share about this or any of our episodes, visit our forum or share it with your friends and family. And please consider donating to Cast of Wonders to help us keep bringing you the best young adult audio fiction week after week. Cast of Wonders is a production of Wolfsbane Publishing and is brought to you by our own terrible trio. Graham Dunlop, your host and audio producer, Barry J. Northern, our publisher and artist, and I remain, as always, your humble editor, Marguerite Kenner. Our episodes are released under a Creative Commons, Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Share it far and wide, just the way it is. The Little Wonders theme, Naversus, is by Alexei Nov and provided by MusicAlley.com. Thanks for listening, and happy Halloween!